So good morning. It's good to be here in Seattle. Let me get a few things out of the way first, but they're important things. First, I want to thank Lisa for inviting me. I know you all know that you hire an executive because they have a good brain, good skills, and good intent. But you lucked out and had a great person with a great heart. And so I'm just really pleased to be here to support her leadership. I also want to thank Dr. Nyland and Jane Broom for this invitation to be here. The second thing I want to tell you, because this is also really important, who here is from Amazon? Okay. I don't know what Jeff Bezos looks like, but tell him I have a crush on him. Thanks for changing my life. And if he wants to meet for drinks later, let me know. Just don't tell my husband. And then the last thing that I actually want to say is that conversations about education tend to happen in rooms like this. And that's a problem. That we really have to figure out how we expand those conversations in a broader arena. And so I really want to invite you to kind of participate via Twitter, not necessarily repeating what I say, but making sure that we're sharing core messages, your core beliefs about what needs to happen in education and equity. And I want to make sure that you know that the Alliance's Twitter account is @Alliance4, ed. And then you can also include me if you like, @Allen_Tonya. Now, I want to tell you, you may not like anything that I say, so if you want to get your tweets out early about me, I appreciate it. You could say something like, she's so cute, she's so smart, whatever, okay? She's fly, I like that too. So I want to actually start with this notion of, and how are the children? Many of you may have heard this. This is actually a Maasai, an African tribe greeting. They ask, and how are the children? And the response, the ideal response is that all the children are well. And the reason that they ask this is because core to their values, core to their beliefs, is that children, if we're going to be a prosperous place, then we as a community must take care of children, that peace and safety is going to prevail, and that the priorities of protecting the young, the priority of protecting the powerless are in place in our community. And that's what we're really talking about when we talk about education and equity. I often think that you tell the soul of a city by how it treats its children. And I think that you all have to decide, what does your soul look like? That's your decision to determine, not necessarily anybody from the outside. But I challenge you to think about it and to answer it for yourself. And then I'm going to try and challenge you throughout the conversation a little bit about what can be done. How do you answer that call to the question and the response of how are you treating your children? So I want to talk a little bit, because many of you may be thinking, like, what in the world does Seattle have in common with Detroit? Seattle right now is a pretty rich place, and you know, Detroit is pretty poor. We're poor, but we're also sexy, so let me just say that. But I actually want to talk to you a little bit about, give you a little context of what Detroit has in common with Seattle and what it doesn't have in common, and what might be the applicable lessons from that work. So I share sometimes, when I talk about the city of Detroit and its recovery, I often talk about Detroit in the context of places like Seattle, San Francisco, Boston, New York City. Because all of these places, including Seattle, 40, 50 years ago, you were in the same position that the city of Detroit was in. People were ready to literally turn off the lights. The last one here, turn off the lights. This is what people said about Seattle. But you came back. And you came back strong. And when I think about the life cycles of cities in general, when cities go through such tough times and when they bounce back in amazing ways, that the economy is strong. And they actually become places where the hotbed of the American economy exists. And so when I think about Detroit in that beginning part of the recovery. And I also think about Detroit in terms of what does the next 20 or 30 years look like for us as a city, and how will our prosperity look? But I often, when I compare Detroit or think about Detroit in the context of this life cycle of cities, I often actually refer to places like Seattle, San Francisco, Boston, and New York as places that we want to beat and outpace. Because I believe that in Detroit, it's our opportunity to do recovery in an inclusive way and to not be trying to do it 30 or 40 years after the fact when it has become harder and harder because you see the divide in the economic conditions and you have the systems that have pretty much reinforced the inequities. Now, I also want to tell you a little bit about the differences between Detroit and Seattle. So in Seattle, you basically have a strong and an intact school system. And in Detroit, the home of Michigan, the home of our new Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, and it was very nice to hear Dr. Nyland had a good meeting with her. I'm glad he didn't mention I was coming here. She would have stopped your plane. We have not always had the greatest experience together, partially because what we have done in Detroit or in the state of Michigan is in the spirit of disruption, what we've done is dismantle. So we have a school system that actually went from about 180,000 students 15 years ago to a school system that has about 45,000 students now. You heard me, 180 to 45. So Detroit has about 110,000 school children in our city, and 88,000 of them attend school in Detroit proper, about half in charter, half in Detroit public schools, and a handful in a state-run district. Very complex environment. We have a school district, we have a state-run entity, and we have 12 other entities, mostly universities, that can open and close schools without any coordination. So as a result, when you have no one in charge, there's no one in charge, and you don't see the results that you would have. So what's compelling to me about Seattle is that you have, in a lot of ways, avoided the kind of shiny, bright quarter or coin that most people swing to when they think about reform. That's a very interesting position to be in, especially because there are many things that you're doing extraordinarily well in terms of proficiency, yet you still have this gap that is sustained between your students with the most needs or your most diverse students. And this is your opportunity, in my opinion, to fix the problem. And I would say, if you're not working desperately as a community to fix that gap, then if you're keeping and retaining the way that education is running, you're actually affirming the narrative that public schools don't work rather than creating a counter narrative. And what I think the challenge is before you is to create the counter narrative that you can have an intact public school system that can serve all children extraordinarily well. I would say that this is your opportunity to prove the nation wrong and also to prove our Secretary of Education wrong, that this can be done and that you're equipped to do it. And I believe that you have all of the necessary resources to do so. Now, I know that every place it doesn't have enough resources going into their schools, but I would say that money is important, but it is not money is important, but it is not the reason why you get better. The reason you get better is because of leadership, and that's what I actually really want to talk to you about, and talk to you about how you use your leadership to advance an equity framework and to really take on diversity, inclusion, and equity. So I want to talk, and I'm going to tell you a few things that I'm going to talk about and get to the extent of it. So what I'm going to really talk about, and I want you to understand, is I'm going to talk about civic leadership. I'm going to talk about equitable investments, not just thinking about programs, but inequities don't live in programs. Inequity lives in systems. and that you have to figure out how you tackle these systemic issues that are creating the differences in your students. How you focus on student-focused learning, and how you make sure that everything that you do in your education system is aligned with the economic growth that your city is experiencing, so that young people have access to that prosperity, and that they're not sitting on the sidelines, and that you're not, as a community, which is so easy to do once you start to see more prosperity, is suburbanizing poverty. And this is going to really require, in a lot of ways, to have a common vision and to work behind that vision, and to understand that the problems that you're actually facing are adaptive challenges, not technical. So I know there's a lot of smart people in this room. How many of you are smart? You also are good looking. How many of you good looking? All right, good. A lot of smart people in here. And a lot of times, as smart people, we think that we can solve any problem. And smart doesn't always solve problems. Smart solves technical problems. But it is very hard for smart to solve adaptive problems. Smart has to be, which I describe as content. How you fix something, what the solution is, has to be deeply connected to context. And that means that you got to have an emotional intelligence, not just an intellectual intelligence. You have to combine those. That's how you get to these adaptive challenges, which is one of the issues that you've been facing. You all are smart enough. You have enough resources in here. If it was just about how intelligent you were, you would have been solved this equity problem. I heard last night from someone who said this problem has been sustained and existing for 40 years. If SMART could have solved it, it would have solved it. This is now about how you bring SMART and your emotional intelligence to this, and understanding that this problem is complex and that it is an adaptive challenge that you as a community are equipped to do and address. But the way that you do that is what I would call education diplomacy. So, education diplomacy, in my opinion, is about using skills such as partnering, collaborating, building coalitions, developing networks, shaping agreements, negotiating, mediating, engaging in critical dialogue, and using the techniques of conflict resolution to eliminate barriers to education and to shape a new agenda for education, specifically for all children in Seattle. Now, here is how I think you kind of work towards this question of education diplomacy. And I'll tell you, before I get to that, in Detroit, this was one of the big issues that we worked on in the last few years. I am sure you have met lots of people who care deeply about education, and you wonder how these people who have the same values about education are always arguing. They can never get along. They all have different ideas about it, be it at a school district, be it the mayor's office, be it philanthropic organizations or business communities. Everybody wants to solve this problem. Parents want to solve it. Community members want to solve it. But they can't figure out how to move the agenda forward. And so in Detroit, we were facing the same challenge. In addition to that, we had this complex governance model that I talked to you about, where literally there was not a Detroiter in charge of any of the schools or any decision-making around the schools, because most of it was under state control or state appointment. And we started to come together and we try to solve our problems by stopping the fighting against each other. We actually talked about leave your weapons at the door. Let's stop fighting against each other, and let's start fighting for children. And that meant that what we had to do was work together and not against each other. And here are things and how you could approach that and do that. One is that my grandmother always used to, so I started with this principle. We started with this principle that my grandmother used to tell me all the time, is that none of us is smarter than all of us. But you got to believe that, because some of us really do think we're smarter than all of us. And then we have to bring these unlikely partners together, and we have to hear their voice voices, but we can't just hear their voices. We have to actually learn their humanity. And so one of the things that we found in Detroit is that we had liberal folks on the left who had never met and sat in a room with Republicans. And one person actually said, and I often think it's so funny, she was like, I didn't think that Republicans cared about anybody. Or you had very conservative Republicans who had this very clear image about who Detroit parents were as these people who allowed their children to go to bad schools, and basically they weren't working hard enough until he got on a bus with a family and spent an hour and a half with a mother as she caught the bus to drop her kids at school and walked 2 miles to get her kids, who were all going to 3 different schools. And then he came back from that experience and he said, now this is a real tiger mom, because she had to basically experience what I call Hunger Games to get her kids to school. So it's when you have that experience of listening and understanding each other's humanity, you come at solutions in a different way and you have a different listening. And we also came at it by using this principle that I describe as the 70-20-10 frame. And 70-20-10 is really simply this, is that if you care about education, on 70% of the things you can agree on. 20% you could probably negotiate on even if you don't agree on, and 10% you will never agree on. But for most of us, when we start education conversations, we start at the 10%, which never allows us to get anywhere. But if you actually pause and hold those to the side and focus on the 70%, it actually allows you to move the agenda forward, and that's exactly what we did in Detroit. So this is really about collective action and leadership. The second thing I want to tell you about education diplomacy is this: your personal leadership matters. We need each of you to make courageous decisions, unpopular decisions. Sometimes that might mean you are saying things that you feel uncomfortable saying. Sometimes it may mean that you're saying things that are not publicly accepted. Sometimes it may mean that you have to say to your person that's sitting next to you, would you be quiet? You don't know what you're talking about. I need you to listen. I need you to hear people. I need you to set aside your judgments so that we can understand together collectively. It means that you got to be fearless. That the first priority, as Lisa talked about, is the children. And you got to focus on that. You got to lead beyond your shortcomings, and sometimes that means you have to lead from behind. A lot of times you hear people talking about why don't our leaders, is that my phone or is that my theme music? Oftentimes you hear, when you see these leadership voids, most of us in this room say, well, I wish blank, blank leader would do something about it. And I would challenge you to say, blank, blank leader doesn't need to do anything about it. You do. Your movement, your actions, your focus, your company's focus, your community's focus, your individual school focus, the teachers, when you move, leaders will move. Lead from the back, lead from the middle. The third thing I would say in terms of education diplomacy is privilege inclusion. Privilege inclusion. So we often, in a lot of places, privilege diversity. So we want a group to be representative, right? So we got to make sure. I think I saw in Detroit, in Seattle Public Schools, I forget how many languages are spoken here. But usually that's like diversity. Okay, we're going to have one Black person, one Hispanic person, one Pacific Asian person. We're going to have one business guy. It's nothing wrong with being representative. But I think the way that I describe diversity is when you count the people. Inclusion is when the people count. And so what I would say, make sure that the people count, by listening to them and not privileging diversity, privilege inclusion, that you really want people to be engaged at the table, in the room, and that you value what they bring. I often say that, a lot of times we talk about bringing everybody to the table, and that's diversity. But when you have people at the table where some folks have to bring folding chairs, that's not inclusion. Everybody needs to have a stabilized place there. And this is really about being good listeners and being good observers, making room for the counter narrative, understanding that people can look at the same sets of data and come with completely different conclusions about it. And it is important for you to understand all of them if you're going to create solutions together. And then the last thing, young people don't need you to fix them. A lot of times we talk about education, and we're talking because we're trying to fix these kids. And, I have 3 daughters. I've tried to fix them. It doesn't work. Inclusion is about making sure that young people's voices are at the table, that you're listening to them, that they also are creating parts of the solution. They can diagnose issues and challenges in ways that we cannot as adults. Even though all of us have been children before, it doesn't mean that we know what it means to be a children today. And half of us have forgotten most of those traumatic experiences as children, at least I have. The last thing that I want to lift up for you, close to the last, I'm terrible at enumeration, is education diplomacy really requires you to relinquish control as individuals. And what I mean by that is this. Oftentimes, we look to school districts, we look to Dr. Allen to fix it. And he has a big job, and he's fixing a lot of things. But he can't hold your education agenda as a community. You have to collectively own that. Because Dr. Allen will be here. He's already come out of retirement. I don't know how long you're going to last. You want to last here. Not how long you're going to last. How long you want to last. That was a correction. But he's going to be here for so long. You're going to be here in that role. You're going to be here as residents and community members for a lot longer than he will be. And thus, the agenda that you're trying to deal with has to live with you, not with him. He has to be a key instrument in executing it. But this is really about you as civic leaders moving this agenda forward. And as you do that, you have to kind of come together around 4 or 5 priorities. Yesterday, I was with a group of people from Seattle, and we had dinner last night, and one of the questions was kind of like, well, what are the 3 or 4 things we have to do? And I was like, it doesn't really matter what the 3 or 4 things are that you do. Just do 3 or 4 things. Just prioritize 3 or 4 things and do them with fidelity, and you will see change. But the challenge is that when you're in a collection of really smart people, we all have a solution, and we end up dispersing all of our energy, all of our resources on multiple things. And we think that the more we do, we will have a higher gain and a higher impact. And when in actuality, coherence is king. Coherence is king, and it is king for communities. If you have a coherent plan for 3 or 4 things, and you implement and execute that with excellence and hold each other accountable, looking at the results and hold each other accountable when somebody says, I have a better idea. You say, no, you sit down and wait. When the community comes back and we go back to 3 or 4 things, then you bring that idea forward. Just because you have freedoms don't mean you have to express them all over our community. And so that, I think, is part of what we have to do if we're going to really provide the kind of civic leadership that's required to move the needle. The last thing is that you have to be persistent. Now, I could give you some really eloquent words about persistent, but I don't have any. So I'm going to give you a quick story, because this is the best and the most persistent person I know. Is my daughter, Alana, and she's 10. Alana is the most persistent person I know, and this, at night, she said to me, as we were putting her to bed, "Hey, Mom, can I have a glass of water?" "No, you cannot have a glass of water, go to bed." Then I went into my bedroom, and then I hear her yelling, "Dad, Dad, Dad." My husband goes in, "What is it, Alana?" "I'd like a glass of water." He said, "Your mother said, no, you can't have a glass of water, go to bed." A few minutes later, "Dad, Dad, Dad, Dad." He comes in, "What is it, Alana?" He's frustrated at this point. He says, "What is it?" She said, "Dad, I want a glass of water." He's like, "Alana, I told you, you cannot have a glass of water. It's time for you to go to bed. Listen, if you ask me again for a glass of water, I'm going to give you a spanking." Now, he's from the South, forgive him. That's the way they did things. He goes back to bed, and the next thing he knows, Alana's yelling, "Dad, Dad, come here, come here, come here." And he said, "What is it, Alana?" And she said, "Can you bring me my glass of water after you give me my spanking?" So the point of this is that this work is hard. You got to be persistent, and sometimes you will get your butt spanked. But you stick to it, and you move forward, and you move through it. And by that, we can make sure that our children, as the Sudanese people will say, are going to be bequeathed with two things. The first one is roots, and the second one is wings. Thank you.